Hello, everyone. My name is Allison Dennis. I serve as Executive Director for the Sitka Center for Art and Ecology, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's talk and discussion with Christina Burke on Indigenous histories, community, and environmental health in Lakota winter counts. We want to thank the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation and Jordan Schnitzer for their extraordinary signature sponsorship of Sitka's 50th anniversary year. When this year started, we did not know the arc of things to come or just how impactful your gift would be. Thank you. We also want to thank our event sponsors, McMinimans, Framing Resource, Brian Potter Design, Siltstone Wines, Schwabe, Williamson and Wyatt, Explore Lincoln City, Park Lane Suites, Tom and Ellen Abrego, and Judy Vogland and Bob Dayton. Thank you, one and all, for sponsoring Sitka's events throughout the years. We want to thank Sitka's co-founders, Jane and Frank Boyden. We are in perpetual thanksgiving for your ongoing inspiration. As this is our fall online program finale, I want to give special thanks to my Sitka colleagues, Nicola Harrison, Tamara Jennings, Nancy Newman, and Lisa DeGrace, who have all been central to bringing these streamed events to you and to getting the word out about them. And speaking of getting the word out, based on pre-registrations, we anticipate that the combined virtual audience joining in today is in the hundreds. So thank you, Sitka community, near and far, for coming together today. For those of you who are participating live with us on Zoom today, after Christina's presentation, there will be an audience question and answer session. So as questions occur to you, please do share them using the Q&A feature. You'll find it at the bottom of your Zoom menu. I will read the questions after the presentation, and I'll do my best to fit in as many as possible in the time we have with Christina. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. Christina E. Burke is a cultural anthropologist with more than 30 years of experience working on a variety of collaborative projects with Native people at such institutions as the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., and the Heritage Center at Red Cloud Indian School on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Since 2006, she has been curator of Native American art at Philbrook Museum of Art in Tulsa, Oklahoma. During that time, she has helped acquire 3 major collections of Native art, curated temporary exhibitions and long-term installations, written on historical and contemporary Native art, and continued working with Native artists and communities on diverse projects. Recently, Burke served on the advisory board for the landmark traveling exhibition, Hearts of Our People, Native Women Artists, a groundbreaking show celebrating the continuing creativity of Indigenous women. As we reflect on all that has transpired in 2020, I can't imagine a more timely talk or expert speaker to join us tonight. Wherever you are, all 300 or so of you, I know it's maybe we can't, but I promise you we can hear you right now. So please make some joyful noise wherever you are and help me welcome Christina Burke to the Sitka Center.
Well, thank you so much, Allison, and everyone who's made this possible. It really is an honor and a privilege to be with you all tonight and to be asked to speak about a topic about which I'm particularly passionate. And I hope that passion comes through in this presentation tonight. I've got lots of images and lots of stories to share with you. So I hope this is working. We've got a map up, let's see. How does that look, Allison? Are we at a title slide?
Yes, there you go. It just loaded. You're great.
Okay, fabulous. I think the file is very big because there's lots of images in there. So anyway, again, thank you all so much for joining me tonight. I'm going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is Plains Indian pictographs, and specifically winter counts or community histories that were kept by the Lakota of the Northern Plains. And we're going to look at pictographs broadly, and then at winter counts specifically, and then focus in on some ways that these tribal historians documented community and environmental health in these indigenous stories. So if I can find my forward button here. So this is a culture area map of North America that many are probably familiar with. So we use these maps, scholars created these maps to talk about environmental and culture areas and kind of categorize and group indigenous peoples together based on a non-native set of criteria. But this is a map that many of us are familiar with, or at least versions of this map. But when we look at a more indigenized version of a map of North America, looking at traditional boundaries of indigenous communities, it looks quite different. In part because communities, Native communities didn't have the kinds of international and state and county boundaries that we do in the 21st century. So thinking about traditional territories, thinking about movement of people across the land, of migrations that could be seasonal following certain animals or plants to harvest, it's a lot more complex a story than what non-native anthropologists like myself have put into that previous map. And thinking about where Sitka is and indigenous people of Oregon, I just wanted to share this map of very care. I think that I got the location of the residency correct, and give recognition to the Tillamook and Siletz people of that region. But I'm actually coming to you from Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is within the boundaries of Muskogee Creek Nation, and part of what we know as the state of Oklahoma, but for a long time was called Indian Territory, in part because this area of land was set aside for Native people, some of whom had been here forever, and others, like the Muskogee Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, were forcibly removed from their traditional territories further east. So Oklahoma, and Tulsa specifically, is really at a crossroads of many Native communities. So there is a rich heritage here where I work currently, and it's really exciting to be in this place, but also to talk about my work on the Northern Plains as well. So back to that culture area map, just very quickly to sort of reorient ourselves, and again, something that's maybe a little bit more familiar. And again, I'll be talking about the Northern Plains, where I've spent a great deal of time in North and South Dakota, and particularly on the Pine Ridge Reservation in southwestern South Dakota. But actually, my story about how I came to work in museums starts way back when I was a small child. And this is not the Northern Plains. This is Teotihuacan in Mexico. My journey into museums, into anthropology, and into working with indigenous peoples came from an experience when I was 5 years old. Because of my father's work, my family moved to live in Mexico City for several months when I was a child. And I'm the youngest of 4, and I think some of my siblings might be on this Zoom today. Anyway, so I'm the youngest of 4 and was 5 years old at the time, and my parents were pulling us out of school for this family change, this family experience. And our teachers were horrified that the Burke children were going to become, were going to be left behind in their formal education by being ripped out of school and having this terrible interruption of their educational experience. So our teachers made my mom promise that she would diligently homeschool us, work with us with a number of workbooks, lessons every day, etc. And my mother did. And we finished those workbooks in about a month and a half. And we had several more months to explore Mexico City and experience a whole other culture, language, histories, etc. My family toured Teotihuacan, and we also toured the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. And having seen this place, and then, oops, that's not what I wanted. Then seeing a scale model of Teotihuacan. As a 5-year-old kid, I had this incredible experience and wondering about how do we know what these other buildings looked like? How do we know what people who built this city looked like, wore, ate, how they talked, how they interacted with one another, how they developed their religious traditions and ceremonies? How do we know what we know about people who are distant from us in terms of time, space, culture, language? And it's that question that propelled me into anthropology, into museum work, and into working with Indigenous people. So over the years, I studied anthropology in college. I had the great good fortune to have a summer internship at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. And during the summer of 1988, I worked on an exhibition, a traveling exhibition called The Crossroads of Continents, Native Peoples of Siberia and Alaska. And it was during that unpaid summer internship that I had the great good fortune to meet King Island singers, Inupiaq people from King Island in the Bering Strait. And they came to the museum to share song and dance and traditional stories. We also had the opportunity to take them through the collections of the Smithsonian of objects from King Island and surrounding communities in Alaska. And that experience changed my life. I got interested in museums specifically, in Native North America, and how those interactions between Indigenous people and museum professionals can change everybody's life. After a couple of years with all kinds of experiences in graduate school and some other non-academic experiences, I actually wound up on the Northern Plains in South Dakota. And it was there in South Dakota that I first encountered these pictographic histories, winter counts, and other kinds of pictographs, in which Lakota people were telling their own stories to each other about themselves. And these were stories that I'd never heard before as a non-Native person growing up in the suburbs of DC. And yet this is part of American history and incredible nuances and complexities to the American story that I'd never heard before. So I worked for about a year and a half at what's called the Heritage Center at Red Cloud Indian School on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And some of you may have traveled to that area, to the Black Hills and Badlands. Pine Ridge is just east of the Black Hills and south of the Badlands. And the Heritage Center has an incredible collection of historical Lakota art, but also contemporary art based on a juried competition that they host every year since 1964. They always collect contemporary Native art from that juried competition. So it's a really incredible mix of old and new right there on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And these experiences culminated in me coming to Philbrook Museum of Art here in Tulsa in Muskogee Creek Nation in 2006. And I've had an incredible opportunity to work with the collections here at Philbrook, to work with Native people from this area and across North America on all kinds of projects, as Allison mentioned. Every once in a while, I get to research and write on historical and contemporary Native art. But my favorite thing about my job and really about life is working with Indigenous artists in collections, whether it's basket makers like Shan Gosshorn, Sarah Sense, and Teresa Secord, or Hopi artists, Verma Nakwatdawa and her siblings, filmmakers like Sterling Harjo, who's from right here in Tulsa, and his crew, who were doing a documentary about one of Sterling's relatives, Jimmy Anderson, whose work is in the Philbrook collections. Or artist Anita Fields and her daughter, Wilena, who are Osage from here in Oklahoma. And they were collaborating on making Welena a traditional Osage wedding outfit for her wedding. And part of that research included doing collections research at Philbrook and other museums and in private collections. So they came into the museum to do research to create this beautiful outfit that Welena wore at her wedding a couple of years ago. And over the years, I've had the opportunity to work with many Lakota families, specifically on these winter counts, on these tribal histories that they have kept in the family or that they're connected to in museum collections. So those kinds of collaborations and connections continue. So there's a little bit of background about me and where I come from and what interests me and kind of how I stumbled into this research on Indigenous histories. So when I'm talking about pictographic histories of the Lakota and some other Plains tribes, these are the kinds of objects that I'm talking about. This is probably the best known Lakota winter count that was kept by a man named Lone Dog. And it covers the years 1800 to 1879, I believe, if memory serves me. And you'll see the images in this spiral on this buffalo hide. Each image indicates one event marking 1 year. So these community histories both documented important events, but also they marked the passing of time from year to year to year. And you can see the images are quite straightforward and sort of esoteric. It's not always immediately apparent what kinds of event or happening is being recorded, but we're going to take a look at that. Before we do, I want to talk a little bit about Lakota stories, Lakota narratives, and different Indigenous categories of those stories. Not academic, but from a Lakota perspective, these oral traditions, pictographic traditions, and written traditions. Lakota people, by and large, became literate in their own language by about the 1870s, 1880s, because of a writing system developed by Christian missionaries. But Lakota people used that writing system for their own purposes in their own way, which we'll see a little later in the presentation. But thinking about these traditional stories, or ohunkakon, stories from individual experiences, personal experiences, war stories, horse stealing stories, and other kinds of stories as well. This word ohunkakon, I'm going to get a little bit linguistic nerdy just for a minute, and then I'll pull back to the pretty pictures. But this category of ohunkakon, or traditional stories, comes from the root word hunka, which means ancestors or relatives, those who were connected in kinship. And oyake, just a generic word for stories to tell, to relate to one another. But then when we look at the pictographic versions of these stories, those images that illustrate the oral traditions, they come from a root word called owa, which means to mark, to make a mark, anything in 2 dimensions. And we have a couple of examples here of how owa as a root word is used to create nouns. So wowapi, that thing that is marked in 2 dimensions. It can be a letter, it can be a book, it can be printed, drawn, painted. The material doesn't matter, but it's marked in 2 dimensions. And then specifically ite wowapi. Ite means face in Lakota. And again, wowapi, it's a face drawing, a photograph, a portrait. And then winter counts, we see wanietu wowapi. Wanietu is the Lakota word for season of winter, the cold season, when the first snow begins. So wanietu wowapi is, they count by winter. So the thing that they mark for winters. So I'll pull back a little bit because I'm not a linguist, but I think it's useful to understand these different categories from a Lakota perspective of how how things are remembered, recorded, and then shared with others. And sometimes we see, as I mentioned, pictures and text, Lakota text, illustrating or annotating the illustrations. So we see a confluence of traditional pictographs and this native language literacy that I mentioned, whether it's a historical event like the killing of Crazy Horse, which we see on the left, and on the right is an example of a winter count where again, we have pictographs and texts. And so those very simple mnemonic drawings or pictographs, many of which look alike, right? We see a lot of log cabins. So how do you know what's happening in those log cabins? Well, you have to read and be able to translate and interpret the Lakota captions or annotations to really understand what's happening when. Just another example of that confluence of image and text. This is a self-portrait by a Lakota leader named White Bull, who was from the Standing Rock Reservation. He was a nephew of the great leader Sitting Bull, and was actually adopted as a son by Sitting Bull. And here we have a self-portrait of White Bull in his regalia and talking about his life here. So lots of Lakota artists, historians, community leaders used this traditional form of history making of these pictographs and the relatively new literary tradition in a mashup to tell stories from their own perspective to their own communities and to others. But when we look at these pictographs, they are part of a much larger system of documenting important events in the lives of individuals and their communities, reaching back millennia into petroglyphs, so pictographs that are chipped into stone that last for, well, ever, we hope. And we see these pictographs on a number of different kinds of materials and kinds of objects, from buffalo hide clothing to teepee covers to cloth used inside teepees, then drawn on paper and sometimes beaded with glass beads into the contemporary as well. So a whole system, a whole network of how Lakota people recorded important events. Again, there's just some close-up examples of buffalo hide robes that we see also in European and American drawings. The drawing on the right was by a Swiss artist named Karl Bodmer, who traveled with a German nobleman, Prince Maximilian, on the Upper Missouri in the 1830s. And even those early European and American explorers saw these pictographs in a variety of forms in these plains communities. And again, images drawn on teepee covers, whether they're full size or that great picture of a child's teepee in the upper right corner. And on cloth that was used to line teepees as well, to sort of insulate the inside of a lodge. But again, we see very detailed drawings on cloth, not just on hide, but cloth, and on clothing, men's clothing and women's clothing. And again, some of these images might look to be esoteric. How do we understand, this disembodied hand? Well, that's actually a capture hand. And when we look at images of horses, probably those horses were captured in battle. So there's lots of stories to be told in these images. Probably the most commonly known version of these pictographs is drawn on the pages of ledger books. So sometimes this artistic tradition, this historical tradition, is known as ledger art. But what I want to emphasize is actually that this tradition goes back much further than ledger books and pencil and paper from acquired in trade from Euro-Americans, but is part of this larger system of documenting important events. We see images of camp, we see images of moving camp, of dances, of ceremonies, as well as more individual experiences, including courting that we see on the left. And on the right, a rather evocative image illustrating an individual's vision quest, or an image that they saw in a dream, in a vision. But we also see these kinds of pictographs rendered in glass beads, which were also items acquired in trade from Europeans and Euro-Americans. And again, we see a variety of kinds of images, but also kinds of objects, including a baby's cradle hood on the left, pipe bag, all kinds of clothing and other objects as well. So these pictographs we find throughout Native communities in a variety of media, styles, and objects. Regardless of the style, the object, the media, there are some conventions that these pictographs adhere to by and large. So one thing is the composition. Usually the movement is from right to left, where we have the protagonist, or sort of the agent, on the right, and the antagonist on the left. There's usually very little in terms of detail of physical features. So you see kind of cookie cutter faces, for instance. So that leaves us to wonder how individuals were identified, and that's by clothing, hairstyle, regalia, weaponry, etc., and often by name glyphs. So again, these pictures, whether drawn, painted, or beaded, are not always immediately understandable. You need a little bit of background and context to really get a sense of who's doing what to whom. Let's see here. There we go. So thinking about composition and the antagonist, protagonist, for instance, battle scenes. If a Lakota was drawing this scene, they would picture themselves or their comrades on the right and their enemy, whether native or non-native, on the left. And in hunting scenes and courting scenes, so we see the hunter on the right and their prey on the left. Now, historically, pictographs, drawn, painted, etc., was the domain of men. So these courting scenes, we see the male actor, it's him doing the courting. So he's on the right and his paramour on the left. And then looking at tribal identity, again, hairstyles, clothing styles, etc. So the Pawnee, who were traditional enemy of the Lakota, historically had this distinctive hairstyle, which we see in these photographs and in the pictograph, and what we know as cuff moccasins that we see in this drawing. Whereas the Crow, another enemy tribe, had a pompadour hairstyle historically, and what's known as panel leggings. So at the bottom of those leggings, you see this rectangle of red wool trade cloth, both in the object and in the picture. And then identifying non-native people. The use of a flat-topped hat was kind of the shorthand for white person. And we see these kinds of hats in these photographs. And in the drawing on the lower right, we see in this battle, the Lakota warrior has knocked that hat off of his enemy, and it's on the ground. It's still that flat-topped hat. We get a sense of the action, but again, who's the protagonist and the antagonist. And also thinking about regalia and what kinds of important material culture, headdresses, etc., can help identify an individual. And one of the reasons that I go through this and have, for instance, this example, is to look at the kinds of sources that are needed to interpret these images drawn by historical people of the past. So thinking about museum collections and these actual objects, looking at the historical photographs of individuals wearing them, and then how the clothing, regalia, weaponry was rendered by artists of the past. So lastly, individual identity and the use of what we call name glyphs. So an individual image to identify a person. So many of you may be familiar with the book Black Elk Speaks, and this is his name glyph. So it's a black elk. So in scenes where there are a number of Lakota men involved in a battle, a ceremony, a dance, we can identify Black Elk by his name glyph. And those glyphs were used in some non-traditional ways as well. This is a page from a census that a US government agent on the Pine Ridge Reservation took in 1880. So when he was asking about the heads of households, of Lakota households on the reservation in 1880, this is the way that a Lakota named Big Road took that census. These are all their names in glyphs. So using that graphic tradition to enumerate who were the heads of households at the time. And sometimes, again, we see a mashup of image and text. So this name glyph in the top, you see these horse hooves facing each other with a line down the middle. And then you see written in Lakota, Okichinatrawa. I've had the great fortune to study Lakota language for a while. So Okichinatrawa means his battle, which I think is rendered beautifully in that name glyph. So a battle, those horses facing each other that we see from their horseshoes. So here he is in battle with a non-native enemy. Again, he's on the right, the enemy on the left. And there's a photograph of him in the collections of the Smithsonian. So we've looked at some kind of general conventions of Lakota pictographs, whether on hide, cloth, paper, bead, etc. And we've looked at a number of examples of biographical pictographs, so illustrating important events in the lives of individuals. But I really want to focus on these winter counts, these tribal histories, so important events in the lives of communities, of collectives, of communities that live together throughout the year. Now, several Plains tribes kept winter counts like this: Lakota, Kiowa, Assiniboine, Blackfeet, etc. But the Lakota were quite prolific. So there's a lot of examples to look at and to kind of analyze. So what on earth are winter counts anyway? Well, as we've looked at just very briefly, they are these community histories in which memorable events, unusual events in the life of the community were recorded, historically in pictographs and later with text and of course oral tradition as well. And as I mentioned earlier, it was just one event that marked the passage of an entire year. And that event was chosen not by an individual, not by the winter count keeper or the historian, but by a council of men. So at the end of the year, this council of men would get together to decide, to look back retrospectively, what was the most important event that affected all of us, not just one person or one family, but us as a group, as a community. And as I mentioned, Waniitu is the word for the cold season, the winter, and is marked by the Lakota from first snow to first snow. So the event was chosen by a council, and this calendar, this history, was shared with the community. It was not esoteric knowledge just among these elder men or just kept by the winter count keeper. But throughout the year, the keeper would unroll or unfold this physical document and would retell these stories in sequence, beginning with the very first one, whatever the date range was on this community history. And he would tell these stories in sequence so that everyone in the community knew their history. But they also could use that history to index events in their own lives. So they might say, for instance, I was born the year the stars fell. I went on my first buffalo hunt the year that we fought the Pawnees across the ice. So that this was widely known and was used on a daily basis to index individuals' lives. And these winter count keepers or tribal historians, often that responsibility to care for the physical object, to add new pictographs, and to remember these stories in sequence was kept within the family. So it would be passed from father to son or from uncle to nephew, for instance. There are a couple of instances of women winter count keepers, particularly from the Standing Rock Reservation, but they were the exceptions that proved the rule. So the kinds of events that were documented were all over the place. And again, the criteria was that these were memorable or unusual events, not things that happened every year, because how would you remember if it's so common that it happens every year? So things like battles with other tribes or with the US Army, treaty negotiations, again, with other tribes or the US government, deaths of leaders, so death of influential person that would have an effect on the community. All kinds of cultural events, the creation of new ceremonies, of intertribal interactions, the presence of contact with non-native people for the first time. Seeing horses for the first time was an unusual event and is marked in many winter counts. And then what we will focus on are natural phenomenon, celestial things, so meteorological phenomenon, things that happened across the earth to the environment, with seasons, with fires, etc., and biological things that happen to Native people as individuals. So things like epidemic diseases. And we see these recorded throughout Lakota histories. So like the other pictographs, those more biographical stories that we looked at, winter counts show up on all kinds of media, from animal hide to cloth, and this incredible winter count teepee cover from the Rosebud Reservation, which we think no longer exists. It probably was destroyed in a fire before the turn of the last century, unfortunately. But we've got a couple of great photographs of it. So I just wanted to share that with you. And again, we see different size cloths, different material, different orientations, but you get a sense of, again, these pretty straightforward mnemonic drawings, even on the back of a map from a parochial school on the Rosebud Reservation, St. Francis Parochial School, any kind of media material where you could record community histories, people did it and shared it in tiny little ledger books. And here we see both pictographs and, again, years, specific dates. And again, sometimes with Lakota language annotations, helping us interpret and really specify these events. But later on, we see pictographs sometimes falling off of these community histories. So we have handwritten, typed, and even some published winter count texts. So the handwritten ones were probably just used within a family, maybe shared within a community. The typewritten one in the middle was collected by a non-native scholar who was then going back to interpret that Lakota language. But the one that's published in this newspaper, Iapio Aye, or The Word Carrier, which was published by Presbyterian missionaries for decades, beginning in 1877, I believe. These winter counts were published, and then that newspaper had an incredible distribution among Native communities of different reservations: Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Cheyenne River, Standing Rock, etc. And so these community histories, which might be specific to one village, one town, would then be shared with many other Lakota villages and towns. And sometimes we see commonalities among them, but sometimes they're specific. There are a couple of contemporary artists who create their own version of winter counts. This one by Dawn Little Sky is in a museum in western Nebraska, agate fossil beds. And she begins in the middle of that hide with the Big Bang and the creation of the earth. And then we can see dinosaurs, and we see prehistoric people hunting these large mammals. And then on the right side, well, we also see cultural events. So soon after the Big Bang and the dinosaurs, we see Christopher Columbus landing in the New World. And it spirals out and continues documenting history, including events from World War II. So we see the internment of Japanese Americans. We see the death of many Lakota people who served in the military in World War II. And we see the explosion of atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So she has reached back into the depths of time and brought it into the contemporary as well, to document experiences from her own lifetime and things well beyond her lifetime. So I'm going to nerd out just for a second again, and then we'll get back to interesting pictures. But I'd mentioned that several Plains tribes kept these pictographic histories. Among the Lakota, there are about 200 examples or so. And over the years, I've been trying to gather as much information on as many examples from pictographs, oral traditions, and textual traditions as possible, and then kind of organize them based on how much overlap there is, how many of the same kinds of events they document. And we see a connection between what is documented and social organization of Lakota bands. So among what, from an academic perspective, we call the northern bands of Hunkpapa, Sanzark, Sihasapa, and Tukettle, Miniconjou and Upper Yanktonai, and then the southern bands of Oglala and Brule or Sichanhu, and then Dakota. So related bands like the lower Yanktonai, but who speak a different language and lived further away and so had different experiences and events to record. So when we see one of these pictographic histories and all of these esoteric mnemonic sketches, how on earth do we know what is being documented? What range of time period, what range of years are we talking about? And how do we even know which direction things are going in? So with these three examples on hide, on cloth, and this teepee cover, I've used this yellow and red circle to indicate what we call an index event, the storm of stars. The Leonid meteor shower of November 12th and 13th of 1833. This meteor shower was spectacular and was seen all across North America. We find all kinds of documents recording this event in native and non-native newspaper articles, interpretations of it, etc. But it is the one event that shows up on every Lakota winter count. It shows up on Kiowa winter counts, Blackfeet winter counts, among the Tohono O'odham of southern Arizona who kept calendar sticks. We see 1833 in that storm of stars when the meteors, the stars all moved around winter. So that is where we start. You find the storm of stars and then you figure out the rest. So here are just a few ways that that Leonid meteor shower is marked on Lakota winter counts. We see a lot of commonalities, sometimes with actual, teepees and that sort of human and celestial connection made. And then again, where we have Lakota text, annotation, titles, wichachpi hichpaye. So those stars, they moved all around, kind of in a jumble. This is a winter count from the Rosebud Reservation, with which I'm quite familiar. It was found in basically in Grandma's attic by someone who knew it was interesting and important. And I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but basically it wound up being donated to the Smithsonian. And so is a particular example that I've had the great good fortune to research quite closely over the years. So with this winter count from Rosebud, we start with that storm of stars. And then, gee, I can't quite see, but I think a couple years later, you see two images across a blue field. And that's the year the Lakotas fought the Pawnee tribe across the ice. So there was a battle in wintertime that happened in 1836. So we see the storm of stars in 1833, the battle with the Pawnee across the ice in 1836, and then we know what direction these images are documenting. So this particular winter count begins in the center and then spirals outward to that top right corner at the very end. So once we know that, we can start comparing these images to documented winter counts, to those written winter count texts, to other kinds of resources and kind of triangulate what are the events being documented here in these tribal histories. And again, we see various kinds of events, celestial, earthly, etc. There's a couple of meteorological phenomenon from not just the storm of stars, but also a meteor that made a loud sound going by, and a lunar eclipse, and some other individual events. So I've talked very generally about pictographs. We've done a really quick and dirty intro to winter counts, and then I want to look at these environmental phenomena, some specific example of stories that Lakota people told themselves about themselves, these events that affected entire communities and were worthy of being remembered and recorded. So 1821, when a star roared, that meteor that I mentioned, and we see a couple of images in the lower left. And in all of the examples, you see one star, but with a tail. And in the examples where we have Lakota text, it says Wichachpi Hoton. Wichachpi means star, and Hoton is a verb meaning to make its characteristic sound. So if we talk about a cat's hoton, we think of meow. A bear hoton is a chuffing noise, and a star's hoton is a screaming roar across the sky. So it wasn't just a visual, but an auditory experience that people saw. And then 1833, which I've mentioned before, that Leonid meteor shower in November of 1833, Wichachpi Hiyaye, or Wichachpi Okiyompi, when the stars moved all around, or when the stars fell, multiple stars at the same time. And then 1869, an eclipse. And in Lakota, the term is we-a. A means to die or be killed, and we is actually the sun. So it was a solar eclipse. And so by looking at these tribal histories, and then again looking at Euro-American documents, we can narrow down these dates and the sequence of events. And then when we look at other kinds of environmental history and things that happened on the ground, again, we see a range of different kinds of occurrences, and thinking about the implications of what these would mean for humans living on the plains at these times. So 1788, when a severe winter, it was so cold that birds fell dead from the sky. So the image itself is just this black bird. And if you only have the pictograph with no oral tradition, no written tradition, no context, you can interpret that a number of different ways. But when we have those Lakota annotations and those oral traditions, we know that it was really cold that winter, and so birds fell from the sky. We also see when a village was destroyed by flood, and this happened during a winter time. So I'll show you the pictures next, but there was a river froze up, and then as in the spring, when the river started to thaw, these huge chunks of ice broke loose and came down, rushing down river, and wiped out an entire village. And we see a number of other instances where winters were so cold, various things happened. People had to adapt and respond in different ways. So one year the snow was so deep they had to wear snowshoes, which you see in the two images in the middle there. Different artists, different communities, but the same event and the similar response. I couldn't find a good picture of it, but there was also 1847 when it was such an icy winter that many people broke their legs. And so you see a drawing outline of a broken leg. And then 1865, another cold winter when many horses died, and that's what we see on the right. So again, we can think about these similar kinds of experiences, but how humans and animals responded to them and what the effect was on the group, on the community, not just one individual or one family, but an entire community and really an ecosystem. Just a couple of examples of that flood that I mentioned. So in 1825, many Sioux drowned in high water. And we see a couple of images, including some people with their hands up. And again, this happened early spring. So the river had had frozen. And when the thaw started, these huge chunks of ice broke loose. And so the village was taken by surprise by this and was just about wiped out. And then thinking about biological events and really, this historical context for this incredible moment right now in 2020, and thinking about the COVID pandemic, and how these contagious diseases have affected communities since time immemorial. Different kinds of diseases, different kinds of effects, the waves that came particularly to Indigenous people in North America, and how these were documented. The incredible, devastating effects on Native people of epidemic diseases to which they did not have immunity. And it's something that is often talked about, and particularly as we lead up to Thanksgiving and thinking about the exchange of food, of knowledge of how to grow and hunt food in this hemisphere, and thinking about unintentional or maybe even intentional exchanges as well. So anyway, just a couple of examples of some of these epidemic diseases in Native communities, and particularly in Lakota communities. So when many women died in childbirth, and it's not clear what that might have been. Some health experts have suggested it might have been pleural fever that the women experienced, and then eruptive diseases like smallpox and measles. And whooping cough. And again, we see on the lower left, we see some people experiencing whooping cough there. But measles and smallpox, this is another one of those examples where if you only have the pictographs to look at, we see a couple different examples of the outline of a human figure with these dots all over. How do we know whether it's measles or smallpox? And what can that mean in terms of historical contact tracing? And how these communities got that disease, what were the effects socially, politically, and in the human toll on Indigenous communities. Well, Lakota people had different words for measles and smallpox. So smallpox was wichahonhon, so these red sores all over. The reduplication of the word ron indicates that it was many sores all over the body. And then measles was known as nawichashli, and I don't really have the definition or etymology of that, but Lakota people did distinguish between measles and smallpox. So again, in looking at these pictographic histories, it's incredibly useful, and I would say necessary, to also look at the linguistic histories and other contexts. Who were Native people in contact with, whether it was French fur trappers, missionaries, traders, government agents, settlers, etc., and to be able to document these outbreaks of specific diseases and maybe even do some contact tracing and how these diseases moved across North America and throughout Indigenous communities of the past. So there, I don't even know how we're doing on time. Ooh, I've gone a little over time. So a good thing I'm on my last slide. But just to recap, these winter count images, texts, and oral traditions are an incredibly important source, not just of Native history, but of American history, of contact, of interaction, of human experiences, of individuals, of communities. And by looking back, it can help us understand our shared past, but also specific presence, and in thinking about who we are as Americans and as human beings today. So there we have it.
Thank you so much, Christina. If you want to go ahead and unshare your screen, I can share some of the comments and questions that have been coming in. And if you have a comment or question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Joan shares wonderful presentation. Thank you, Christina. Jane shares, thank you so much for including a few words of Lakota. I grew up a bit south of Pine Ridge and had a great desire to learn Lakota as a child. The sounds are in my ears.
Lila Washte, very good.
We have an anonymous question, just a clarification that women played no role in choosing the winter count events. Is that correct? Did you want to just elaborate a bit on gender roles within winter counts?
As far as we know, that is correct. So when these objects, these documents were first collected in the 1870s or so, often by military officers who were stationed at on reservations. Most of those military officers didn't know Lakota, so they were working through a translator or interpreter. And they weren't asking a lot of questions about how these things were created and who was in the deciding council. We do know from, in terms of who was keeping the winter counts, who was marking them, remembering the stories, sharing the stories, it was almost always men. And again, passed down from father to son, uncle to nephew. The anomaly is on the Standing Rock Reservation. Teresa Yellow Lodge was given 3 forms of a winter count by her grandfather, I believe it was. Oh, and I'm blanking on his name. But anyway, so yes, this was mostly the domain of men. Now, I'm quite sure that various wives, mothers, sisters had some say in that council of what was decided to be recorded. And again, women like men in the community knew these stories. So it was not, the knowledge of this history was not just the domain of men, but the creation and keeping of it almost always was, as far as we know.
And you shared one contemporary example of a contemporary artist picking up on a winter count tradition. Do you just want to speak a bit about the contemporary practice in Lakota winter counting families today?
There are a few, really just a handful of contemporary artists who create winter counts specifically. There are lots of contemporary Native artists, not just Lakota, but from various other tribes, who work in this pictographic tradition, both in 2 dimensions, drawing, painting, etc., on hide, cloth, paper, canvas, as well as in beading. And you see sort of a fluorescence in terms of the drawing and painting in the 1980s by Native women and men, painting and drawing in this traditional style. And in beadwork, again, there certainly has been a fluorescence, I would say in the last 20 years or so, of creating pictographs with beads by contemporary Native men and women from various tribes.
Got a comment from Judith who says, thank you so much. The pictographs are so beautiful. I love the spiral of the events. I appreciate how you incorporated the language. A question from Deborah who asks, so much of what I've learned over the years, I'm 74, is probably so slanted one way or another, either toward a white dominant perspective or a romanticized, perhaps, view of Native life. Can you suggest any reading or films that give a balanced view of the history of the relationship between white people and Native people? I hope my question makes some sense.
It makes a lot of sense, but it's also a huge question.
Yeah.
I'll be happy to share some resources with Sitka that they can share out among participants here. I would say in the past 20 to 30 years, Native artists, scholars, filmmakers have been telling more of their own stories from their own perspectives. And we were talking a little earlier about our US Poet Laureate, Joy Harjo, who's a member of Muskogee Creek Nation and lives right here in Tulsa. To have an Indigenous woman as the US Poet Laureate telling her stories from her perspective to the nation and to the world is incredibly powerful. To have filmmakers like Sterling Harjo, actually no relation to Joy, telling stories through documentary and feature films. Authors like Louise Erdrich, although her work is fiction, but still telling these stories based on historical facts, based on family stories and experiences, and Native scholars at universities, colleges, granting agencies all over the place. So there are lots of opportunities and resources to hear those Native voices. And as I said, for me, stumbling on winter counts and realizing there was so much I didn't know, and thinking about the importance of perspective in history and storytelling. So one quick side note, one of the commonly known events from American history is the Custer Battle, right? Uh, June 25th, 1876, we've all heard of General George Armstrong Custer and that battle with the 7th Cavalry where the cavalry was wiped out. Well, that event does not show up on many winter counts. It was not particularly memorable from a Lakota perspective. It was just another time battling with the white guys where we happened to win. But what does show up on many winter counts the next year of 1877 is that the Army confiscated horses. So as punishment for routing Custer and the 7th Cavalry, the U.S. Army rounded up the horses of many Lakota leaders like Red Cloud and American Horse on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And so that event is documented in Lakota winter counts because that was devastating to them. They couldn't move camp. They couldn't hunt as effectively. They couldn't defend their families, their communities, their lifeways without those horses. So it's that perspective of what's important enough to document and to tell ourselves about again and again.
We'll squeeze in a few more questions. A question from Jean, who asks, prior to pencil and ink, what media was used in pictographs on hides or cloth? They appear to have aged well from the examples you shared.
So yes, prior to pencils and inks on cloth and paper, those hides would be painted with different kinds of pigment from vegetal dyes and using a glue often created by boiling down sinew, which makes it stick to that hide really well. But it's a lot easier to draw on cloth and paper than it is to try and to make the pigment, well, kill the animal, process the hide, tan it, and then mix up the pigment and draw on it with either a sharpened stick or a sharpened piece of bone. Once you have cloth and paper, ink, colored pencils, gee, it's a lot easier. Let's just do it like that.
Mary asks, in what kind of situation would the stories have been recounted from the winter count object? Can you share just a bit more about the tradition, the oral history tradition of using the winter counts to share stories?
Sure. And as I mentioned, throughout the year on various occasions, the winter count keeper, the tribal historian, would bring out that object, unfold it, unroll it, and tell all of those stories in sequence, not just one of them. So people couldn't request, oh, tell about the storm of stars. Okay, but we have to have, it was so cold that those crows fell from the sky, and then, and go through the entire sequence all the stories in sequence. So at various events, perhaps a leader taking on that responsibility. If there were visitors from another Lakota band or even another tribe, it would be an opportunity for the community to say who they were and what they had been through, what they'd experienced, what they'd accomplished, who they were politically. Well, we've had treaties with these other tribes or with the US government in this way. This is who we are. So these were stories that they would tell themselves, but also to tell visitors and outsiders also.
I have a comment and a question from Nancy, who says that she enjoyed this so much. My great-grandparents and grandparents lived in South Dakota, so I grew up hearing many stories. Your presentation has added so much to my remembering. Old Bull was a personal friend of my grandfather. Thank you so much. And then Nancy's question is, what is the oldest historical winter count representation you have experienced?
So there are several of these winter count traditions. So these individual winter counts, but that are related because they all record the similar events that start in the late 1700s, like 1795. There are a couple that go back into the 1600s. And there is one tradition by a father and son duo, Baptiste Good or Brown Hat, Wapotkanri, and his son High Hawk, that are anomalous. Baptiste Good starts his winter counts with what we academics call generational cycles. So instead of one image per year, he drew these camp circles. So a circle of teepees representing 70 years or the generation of an old man. And so these generational cycles date back to 900 AD.
Just a few more comments and a few more questions. Ruth shares wonderful program. Deborah shares the presentation has been so wonderful on so many levels. Thank you, Sitka, and thank you abundantly to you, Christina Burke. A question about, let's see, did all, I think you spoke about this briefly, but can you just remind us, Christina, did all tribes do winter counts, or was this a Lakota tradition?
There were several Plains tribes that had this artistic tradition of pictographs, documenting important events of individuals' lives, but only a handful of Plains tribes specifically, so tribes from the Plains region, kept these community histories. So the Kiowa, Assiniboine, Blackfeet, and Lakota. And of those, Lakota have the most examples of images, text, and oral traditions. But there were other record-keeping devices in other communities. So the Tohono of southern Arizona that I mentioned, the Pima community, had what are known as calendar sticks. So it would be a wooden stick, and there were notches cut into that stick to record important events like the Leonid meteor shower of 1833. I've only looked at those tangentially, but other tribes had other ways of recording stories, both oral traditions and in some kind of tangible object. But it was Plains tribes specifically who had these pictographs, and Lakota just made the most of them.
We've had a couple viewers ask if is a way for people to contact you. Do you want to share your Philbrook email, or should people send comments to Sitka to forward?
Either way is fine. My work email is my first initial C and my last name, Burke, B-U-R-K-E, at philbrook.org. I'm pretty easy to find.
Got two closing questions, and then I'll bring the evening to completion. This is Maureen's question, who asks, might you comment on the significance of the spiral shape of the winter counts? How would the artist signify an end?
When they ran out of space. So most pictographic winter counts are spiral, beginning in the center and spiraling outwards. But some of them begin at the outer edge and spiral inwards. And some are serpentine and read left to right, right to left, left to right, right to left. So as I've looked at different examples, there's no one way. The important thing was maintaining that sequence, that chronology, because again, it was one event per year and also marked the passing of time. And occasionally in the winter count texts, you'll see not much happened winter. So they still had to have something to mark the passage of time, but not much was happening. So on to the next.
I look forward to our next year where not much is happening.
Yes, I think deciding if we were making a pictographic winter count of 2020, what would be the image?
What would be the image?
The one image.
We have a closing question. And on a more personal note, Lynn Marie asks, how did you experience this intense study and learning and reporting of winter count as a non-Native woman?
Well, it's been a journey and continues to be, but I would say I have leveraged my privilege, beginning from that unpaid summer internship at the Smithsonian, and having access to collections that I know many Native people don't have access to, and leveraging those opportunities that I've had to do museum research to, it's not exactly pay it forward, but keeping collections open. So some of those images that I shared with you about my biography and kind of introduction, it is incredibly important to me to continue to make museum collections and my own research accessible to Native people. So if I can do a little plug real quick.
Plug.
So one of the projects I worked on, The Year the Stars Fell, Lakota winter counts at the Smithsonian, was an opportunity to look at winter counts at the Museum of Natural History, the National Museum of the American Indian, resources in the National Anthropological Archives, documents, photographs, linguistic material, gather it all up, and then take that information and those resources that are locked away in our nation's capital and share them in a variety of ways with communities on Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Cheyenne River, and Standing Rock. So my colleagues, Candace Green and Russell Thornton and I went on kind of a lecture series, but sharing these resources from the Smithsonian with community members on these 4 reservations and asking them what would be useful to you all. We were planning on doing a book, but what would be useful to you? A website, CD-ROM, teacher resource, what would be useful? And they said, all of it. We want all of it. We didn't know that our community histories wound up in this place. So we want a website. We want that CD. We want these teacher resources. And so the tangibles that we gathered together and presented from Smithsonian collections are still being used at tribal colleges and at, for instance, the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. So looking at these artistic traditions, these historical traditions, these cultural traditions that are part of museum collections that are far away from Native communities. It's so important that non-Native museum folks like myself continue to make these resources available through exhibits, through programs, online, publications, research, that behind the scenes stuff. As I said, that's my favorite thing about my job, is when Native people, particularly artists, are interested in seeing paintings, beadwork, whatever it is that we have that's not on exhibit.
Rebecca shares a sentiment that I share as well. Rebecca writes, "Thank you, Christina. I hope you get to come to Oregon in person in 2021. We were originally scheduled to host you in person, and the invitation still stands. We'd love to welcome you back when that's possible to do." Sitka thanks and acknowledges the first artists and ecologists to live and work in this place on the Oregon coast, who are today represented by the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians and the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, and whose stewardship of Cascade Head and the coast continues today. We offer gratitude to the land itself, for those who have cared for it for generations, and for the opportunity to learn, work, and reflect on this land. We thank Christina Burke for sharing her research and her passion with us today. You can come nerd out with us anytime, Christina. And thank you, everyone in the Sitka community, for joining us this evening. May your passions engage you in 2021 like a screaming roar across the sky. On behalf of everyone at Sitka, we wish you a good evening. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Thanks to my colleagues at Sitka. Thank you, Christina. Good night, everybody.
Wopila Tonka. Thank you.